Hi, happy Saturday. Today I'm going to read something that is probably a little premature for some people, but it is now like 30 degrees here, and as you see, I am bundled up because I'm cold. Part of this is for the costume to go with today's story, and part of this is because, well, like I said, it's freezing outside, and unfortunately, nothing stuck, but it did snow yesterday morning. So I thought I would do a winter-themed scary story. This one is from No Hope Beyond This Point. I don't have my book with me. I'm gonna read off of a printed copy instead. And this one is called Cold Revenge. I hope you enjoy it. Cold Revenge. Georg spotted Ulrich from across his tobacco field. He quickly mounted up and followed the man. But Ulrich had seen him as well, and had urged his horse to quicken its pace. The coward isn't going to get away that easily, Georg thought to himself. When he reached the small wooded area that caused the dirt road to bend and wind, Georg decided to cut through, requiring him to dismount and go on foot. Ulrich heard boots crunching through snow and saw branches being shoved aside. He reined his horse and clenched his jaw. Fine. If Georg wanted a confrontation so bad, he'd give him one, Ulrich decided, sliding to the ground. He just finished tying up his horse when Georg emerged onto the pathway. I will have my say, Ulrich. You will not come past my land and deny me, Georg yelled. Ulrich scoffed and turned his back on his former friend. He pretended to busy himself by checking the reins and straightening his frock coat, all to bide his time. Georg stood there, seething with rage, waiting for the other man to turn around. Fists clenched and unclenched, and when Ulrich finally faced his foe, Georg punched him. Ulrich stumbled back, his hand going to his jaw. He hadn't expected Georg to actually do anything. He was normally so meek. Georg tensed, waiting for the other man to retaliate. Instead, Ulrich smirked at him. Georg saw red and lunged at Ulrich. The two men grappled with each other, shoving and punching closer to the tree line. Ulrich tripped over the underbrush, falling back into the snow. Georg didn't relent. He kicked at Ulrich, who moved back and out of the way. Ulrich managed to get back on his feet and shoved Georg against a tree. Snow rained down on them. A fierce wind blew through the small forest, and a noise came from above. Both men paused for a moment in confusion, but Ulrich recognized the sound first. He held Georg where he was, only letting go when the cracking grew in intensity. A large, snow-laden bough snapped off and fell on Georg, hitting and pinning him to the ground. Ulrich had managed to step back in time, leaving him unscathed. Georg groaned and shifted beneath the branch and its many smaller offshoots. He lay on his stomach, trying to regain his wits. Use this time to calm down, Georg, Ulrich warned. This feud of ours is petty. Petty to whom? Georg spat. How can you see making underhanded deals with the bank as petty is beyond me? You're trying to strip me of my property. Ulrich shrugged. It is simply a business arrangement. One that will leave me destitute, Georg muttered. He tried to push the large branch off of himself, but to no avail. Ulrich watched the fallen man struggle, taking a small amount of glee in the situation. Georg attempted to find purchase in the snow, trying to pull himself forward, but didn't seem to make any headway. After a few tense moments, Ulrich decided to at least be civil. Shall I lend you a hand? He offered. Georg stopped and glared up at his foe, blood dripping into his eye from a head wound he did not know he had. Help? From you? George's voice dripped acid. I'd rather die. And so you may, a rebuked Ulrich said. He turned on his heel and marched back to his horse. He brushed the debris from his riding pants, remnants of their fight, and mounted his steed. You deserve this fate, not I, Georg yelled from his prison. Perhaps I'll return later to check on you, Ulrich shouted back. I'll at least send word to your estate upon my arrival at home, so they may look for you. Georg bit back the retort on his lips, intent on freeing himself instead. Ulrich waited a moment. He heard nothing but grunts and scuffling noises from the trapped man in the woods. Feeling that he'd done his duty and was the bigger person for at least offering help, Ulrich urged his horse away from the scene. It's not my fault if Georg is too stubborn to accept my assistance, Ulrich rationalized. However, a small sliver of guilt did persist in the back of his mind. It distracted him as he rode homeward. When a pile of snow fell from a few branches onto the path, Ulrich was only loosely holding the reins. His horse spooked, rearing up enough to unseat Ulrich, who landed heavily on the ground. A sharp pain pierced his side, and he twisted his wrist, attempting to unsuccessfully catch himself. He lay there momentarily, trying to get his bearings, while his horse continued on without a rider. Ulrich pushed himself back onto his feet. He stood there, swaying unsteadily, feeling a bit disoriented. Had I hit my head when I fell? I don't remember doing so, but perhaps. Ulrich took a few ragged breaths, the pain in his side intensifying. He looked down the lane at the distant shape of his horse and decided that the best course of action would be to return to George's estate, and perhaps release George from his confinement in the process. Holding a hand gingerly to his ribs, Ulrich began his trek back to his former friend. His movements were sluggish and clumsy as he walked along the road. The cold wind seeped in through his clothes, and Ulrich began to feel tired. He shook his head in an effort to stay awake. He was not far from where he had left George. Ulrich thought about how grateful George would be to see him again. Perhaps grateful enough to reasonably talk about my business arrangement, he mused. Ulrich would see to it that George got some of the proceeds, as his land was rich and fertile. It should fetch a nice sum when divided up. Ulrich paused for a moment to catch his breath, and was hit by a moment of clarity. He and George used to be so close. Ulrich couldn't even remember what slight had driven them apart, or why he felt the need to retaliate in such a manner. He softly chuckled to himself, caught in his own lie. Ulrich could remember why he agreed to buy up George's land in such a scheme. The money he was to receive would pay off his debts and see to it that his land appreciated in value. Ulrich couldn't see passing up such an opportunity. He continued walking down the lane, and when he saw the scuff marks in the snow, he knew he'd reached his destination. He moved towards the wooded area, taking another moment to rest against a tree. Guilt reared up. Is this the same tree I forced George against? Ulrich straightened up, the pain in his side briefly flaring to life. He coughed, not realizing that he expelled blood as he did so. The world grew fuzzy again, and he trudged forward. Ulrich saw the large bough where George had lain, but his old companion was not there now. Judging by the disturbance in the snow, it looked as if help had come for George. I suppose that's a good thing. Ulrich sat down heavily on the cold ground. He barely shivered, his body numbing up. With a weary sigh, he leaned back on the heavy branch that had trapped George and shut his eyes. He felt worn out. Ulrich thought of the pain George had been in as he struggled under the bough. Why had I taken pleasure in that? How have I become this person? He wondered. He took shallow breaths and groggily opened his eyes. Had he heard the crunch of boots on snow? Ulrich wasn't sure, so he lifted his head and looked around. He thought he saw George moving towards him. The vision wavered, and George disappeared. Ulrich felt panic as he realized how dire his situation was. I'm sorry, he yelled into the wind. He slumped back down as another bout of coughing racked his body. Ulrich thought he heard the crunch of boots again, this time imagining they softly tread in front of him. Ulrich turned his head to see the mirage of George in front of him. I am sorry, Ulrich whispered, his strength waning. He hoped his apology would mean something. He envisioned George stretching out a hand to him in forgiveness. Ulrich reached out his own hand, but after a moment he realized it was a futile effort. There was no one there to save him. Letting his hand drop down, Ulrich fell back against the branch and closed his eyes one last time. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you are in a much warmer place than either Ulrich or myself. Though, I mean, there is heat in this house, but it is still really chilly. Yeah, let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. It was a fun one to write. I came up with the idea originally as a teenager, but it was just a very short snippet. And then I drug it out, dusted it off, and expounded on it. So yeah, hopefully you like it. And that's it, I guess. See you again in 2 weeks. Bye.